Welcome back, everyone. This is another edition of Morning Jim Poetry. And yeah, I'm Jim Ransom. We're going to have some new stuff today. After all, a new month is just beginning. And it's not entirely a nice month if you live in California. It's snowing record amounts out there, but of course, they've had a drought for years, so they probably ought to appreciate the snow. We are anticipating 2 birthdays early this month and are trying to get ready. That's our thing here. But the weather here is nice. No snow on the ground, temperature in the 50s, and sun shining brightly. What could be better in the month of March? Today, though, as I told you last week, I'll be reading poems written by Billy Collins, one of our recent poet laureates of the United States, and one of the most prolific poetry writers. And also, he's been very successful financially, I think. Nobody gets rich writing poetry, but he's independent. And currently, I don't think he has any academic appointments to prop him up. So we're going to read from his book that's called Sailing Alone Around the Room. Sailing Alone Around the Room. And then from another book that contains poems that he selected. It's called Poetry 180. He came to the title Poetry 180 with a subtitle, A Turning Back to Poetry. That's where he gets the 180 gimmick. And he felt that some poetry had become so full of double meaning and abstraction that readers simply didn't want to put up with it. The best and most read poems for several hundred years have been those that people could really understand on at least some level. And sometimes there are more levels to comprehend beyond the one that they get. Billy Collins has created a syllogism about poetry, which I like. It goes like this. I understand English. This poem is written in English. I have no idea what this poem is saying. Have any of you ever felt that way? Well, it's kind of nice to know that Billy Collins has had that same experience. I like to read and write poems which are easily comprehensible. Poems that do not allude to the goings-on in ancient Greece or Rome. Not that there's anything wrong with having a little ancient history erudition, but that was then, this is now. Readers or listeners will flee from poetry if they feel overwhelmed by it. After all, we go to the movies and watch TV, so we are used to pictures with words, and sometimes word pictures are hard for us to recreate in our minds. Poetry often has rhymes, which help, metaphor and meter, which are great but require some effort. I think in the long run, we all have to conclude with Fran Lebowitz that good poems are poems I like, and bad poems are poems I don't like. She was right on top of that, wasn't she? That has a calming and satisfying feel to it, don't you think? It implies that if you don't like a poem, it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with you. Not at all. Okay, now let's turn our attention to Billy Collins, and we're going to read a poem from Sailing Alone Around the Room. It's called First Reader. I can see them standing politely on the wide pages that I was still learning to turn, Jane in a blue jumper, Dick with his crayon brown hair, playing with a ball or exploring the cosmos of the backyard, unaware they are the first characters, the boy and the girl who begin fiction. Beyond the simple illustration of their neighborhood, the other protagonists were waiting in a huddle, frightening Heathcliff, frightened Pip, Nick Adams carrying a fishing rod, Emma Bovary riding into Rouen. But I would read about the perfect boy and his sister, even before I would read about Adam and Eve, or Garden and Gate, and before I heard the name Gutenberg. The type of their simple talk was moving into my focusing eye. It was always Saturday, and he and she were always pointing at something and shouting, "Look!" Pointing at the dog, the bicycle, or at their father as he pushed a hand mower over the lawn, waving at aproned mother framed in the kitchen doorway, pointing toward the sky, pointing at each other. They wanted us to look, but we had looked already and seen the shaded lawn, the wagon, the postman. We had seen the dog, walked, watered, and fed the animal, and now it was time to discover the infinite, clicking permutations of the alphabet's small and capital letters. Alphabetical ourselves in the rows of classroom desks. We were forgetting how to look and learning how to read. I think that's a very nice poem, and it takes one of the earliest experiences that people Billy Collins' age and I, and maybe some of you, had with learning to read with Dick and Jane. I don't know how long they were around, but it was for a long time. And it worked. If it hadn't worked, those textbooks about Dick and Jane would not have been used for generations and generations of students as they were. Now, there's another poem I want to read, which is not from that book. It's from Poetry 180, A Turning Back to Poetry. And it's by a gentleman named Marc Petersen. And here it is. What would I do if my wife were to have an affair? I would walk to my toolbox in the garage, take from it my 12-inch flathead screwdriver and my hickory handle hammer, the one that helped me build 3 redwood fences, and I would hammer out the pins in all the door hinges in the house. And I would pull off all the doors, and I would stack them in the backyard, and I would empty all the sheets from the linen closet, and especially the flannels we have slept between for 19 winters. And I would empty all the towels, too, the big, heavy white towels she bought on Saturdays at Target, and the red bath towels we got for our wedding and which we have never used. And I would unroll the aluminum foil from its box and carry all the pots and pans from the cupboards to the backyard and lay this one long sheet of aluminum foil over all our pots and pans. And I would dump all the silverware from the drawer onto the driveway. And I would push my motorcycle over and let its gas leak out. And I would leave my Jeep running at the curb until its tank was empty or its motor blew up. And I would turn the TV up full blast and open all the windows. And I would turn the stereo up full blast with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony on it, Schiller's Ode to Joy really blasting. And I would strip our bed and I would lie on our unstripped bed and on our stripped bed, and I would see our maple budding out the window. I would see our maple budding out the window. The hummingbird feeder hanging from its lowest bough. And my cat would jump up to see what was the matter with me, and I would tell her. Of course, I would tell her. From her, I hold nothing back. Oh, my goodness. That is a very clever poem. And when I looked up some information about Marc Petersen, I see that he wrote, when Billy Collins got him to write a note for the book, he wrote, "My big cat follows me from room to room. She's black on top, with a white belly and paws, and a white tip on her tail. Her name is Penny. We found her at the pound. I love my wife, too. We've been married 20 years. Poetry helps me clarify." We still don't know where Marc Petersen works, if he does. But I think that was very clever of him to respond to Billy Collins in that way. Okay, now we're going to hop back to the very last poem in the book I showed you by Billy Collins. And the last poem is called The Flight of the Reader. You'd think we would have had enough of one another. After all, the rain streaming down these windows, the walks out to the garden when it clears, the same yellow and white flowers all the sleepless nights, the toy car going in circles on the bed table. But still, you stay perched on my shoulder, cricket or bluebird, wild parrot digging your claws into my loud shirt. Is it because I do not pester you with the invisible gnats of meaning, never release the whippets of anxiety from their crates, or hold up my monstrous mirror, a thing the size of a playing field? Whatever makes you stay, I hate to think of that morning when I will wake up to find you gone, heading toward the open sea, dragging the cables that bound us together, leaving me with nothing more to say. But don't get me wrong. It's not that I cannot live without you, cannot sit under an ordinary green tree with no desire to reach for the pen in my pocket or lie contented on a couch all day, one hand over my mouth. It's not like I have a crush on you, and instead of writing my 5-paragraph essay, I am sailing paper airplanes across the room at you. It's not that I can't wait for the lunch bell to see your face again. It's not like that. Not exactly. He's saying goodbye to us at the end of the book. And in his roundabout way, he's saying, that's okay. It's not like you can't live without me or I can't live without you. But it is a little bit like that. I get such a kick out of Billy Collins. Now, you may decide you have spent enough time with me today, and if so, that's okay. But I have one more poem I want to read you, and it's by a poet named Ross Gay. It's called Opera Singer. Today, my heart is so goddamn fat with grief that I've begun hauling it in a wheelbarrow. No, it's in anvil dragging from my neck as I swim through choppy waters swollen with the corpses of hippos, which means lurking somewhere below is the hungry snout of a croc waiting to spin me into an oblivion worse than this run-on simile, which means only to say, I'm sad. And everyone knows what that means. And in my sadness, I'll walk to a cafe and not see the light in the trees nor finger the bills in my pocket as I pass the boarded houses on the block. No, I will be slogging through the obscure country of my sadness in all its monotone flourish. And so, imagine my surprise when my self-absorption gets usurped by the sound of opera streaming from an open window, and the sun peeks ever so slightly from behind his shawl, and this singing is getting closer so that I can hear the delicately rolled R's like a hummingbird fluttering the tongue, which means a language more beautiful than my own. And I don't recognize the song, though I'm jogging toward it and can hear the woman's breathing through the record's imperfections. And above me, two bluebirds dive and dart, and a rogue mulberry branch leaning over an abandoned lot drags itself across my face, staining it purple and looking now like a mad warrior of glee and relief. I run down the street, and I forgot to mention the 50 or so kids running behind me, some in diapers, some barefoot, all of them winged and waving their pacifiers and training wheels, and nearly trampling me when in a doorway I see a woman in slippers and a floral house dress, blowing in the warm breeze, who was maybe 70, painting the doorway. And friends, it is not too much to say, it was heaven sailing from her mouth, and all the fish in the sea and giraffe saunter, and sugar in my tea, and the forgotten angles of love, and every name of the unborn and dead from this abuelita only glancing at me before turning back to her earnest work of brushstroke and lullaby. And because we all know the tongue's clumsy thudding makes of miracles anecdotes, let me stop here and tell you, I said thank you. That's a great little poem. It's a poem that gives you information and then takes you around enough corners to surprise you at the edge of each. The opera is not from a recording. The singer is a 70-year-old woman who's painting something. And she doesn't care if you're there listening to her. It's a very, very interesting poem. And I was glad to find it and glad to read it to you. The Opera Singer is the name of it. Well, that's it for today. I hope this helps clarify that modern poetry doesn't have to be unintelligible, but sometimes it has to be read twice. But that's not a bad thing, is it? Hope you'll be back next week when we will leap back in time and read some excerpts from some of Shakespeare's plays. Not his sonnets, but his plays. His poetic plays. I think it will be a lot of fun. Bye now.